Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, this is Jay Shapiro. Thanks for listening. This program will be broadcast during the period between the New Year, Rosh Hashanah, and the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. So I want to extend my best wishes to all the listeners for a healthy and happy New Year. One of the most important things that happened during the last few weeks of the outgoing year is the agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, which we hope will be the harbingers of agreements with other Arab and Muslim countries. These agreements came about because of a complex of reasons and geopolitical factors, including the fact that the Sunni Muslim countries are worried about the dangers to themselves from the Shiite regime of Iran. These are complicated geopolitical issues that will keep all the commentators busy and will be the subject of many books that will be written by experts and those who consider themselves experts. Keep in mind that the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain do not share borders with Israel, never sent troops to fight against Israel like other Muslim countries did, and they don't have borders and no problem with Israel. But it is a major step forward, and we can only hope that the circle of peace will grow. I'll also say a few words on this program about the small Jewish community in Bahrain, which is not well known at all and will probably become of prominence as more Jewish businessmen and tourists will be involved with these countries. And I do want to say a few words about the effects of the coronavirus upon the mental health of those under lockdown. Israel, for example, has had a large increase in suicides, but this is reflected in other countries also. Again, thanks for listening. I'll be back after the break. And again, best wishes for the new year.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. I want to say a few words how the fact that Israel has established formal relations with two Muslim countries, how has it affected the Palestinians and our relationship with the Palestinians? At this pace, Palestinians might wake up one morning to discover they no longer have any friends in the Arab countries at all. An Iraqi writer wrote the following: the Palestinians failed to establish their state. They failed because they did not want to establish a state. I mean the political leaders, some of whom still insist on repeating revolutionary phrases. They feel that the establishment of a Palestinian state will be a burden on the Palestinian leaders and will prevent them from practicing corruption. The Palestinian Authority is no longer suitable to represent the Palestinian people, unquote. This is from an Iraqi writer. Another Islamic cleric in the United Arab Emirates wrote the following: Israel did not destroy Syria. Israel did not burn Libya. Israel did not displace the people of Egypt. Israel did not destroy Libya, and Israel did not tear up Lebanon. Before you Arabs blame Israel, take a look at yourselves in the mirror. The problem is in you. This is, as I said, an Islamic cleric. Another Saudi writer on September 18th wrote, Palestinian leaders failed to invest in opportunities. They failed to take strategic decisions and chose instead to forge an alliance with Iran. So the biggest losers, of course, are again the Palestinians, who are quickly losing the sympathy of a growing number of Arabs. Several Palestinian factions have urged the Palestinian leadership to withdraw from the Arab League in order to protest the refusal of the Arab countries to condemn normalization with Israel. Earlier this month, the Arab League foreign ministers refused to endorse a Palestinian draft resolution condemning the UAE for its decision to make peace with Israel. The Palestinians have removed their ambassadors to the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain in protest of the signing of the peace deals between those two Gulf states and Israel. The Palestinians are now threatening to withdraw their envoys from any Arab country that follows suit and establishes relations with Israel. In addition, several Palestinian factions have urged the Palestinian leadership to withdraw from the Arab League to protest the refusal of the Arab countries to condemn normalization with Israel. And this is the situation now. The Palestinians write that normalization with Israel is a huge betrayal of the Palestinian issue and a stab to the sacrifices and pain of the Palestinians and the Arabs. The threats to pull out from the Arab League and withdraw Palestinian ambassadors from Arab countries that establish relations with Israel have sparked mockery and a flurry of critical comments in the Arab world itself, particularly the Gulf states. The main theme of what they write is that the Palestinians do not learn from their mistakes. The Arab criticism, which is directed mostly against the leaders of the Palestinians, is yet another indication of the growing antagonism between the Palestinians and the rest of the Arab world. At this pace, Palestinians might wake up one morning to discover they no longer have any friends in the Arab countries at all. Many Arabs are outraged by the Palestinian threats as well as the daily attacks on the UAE and Bahrain. These include accusations by the Palestinians that those two Gulf states who made peace with Israel had betrayed the Al-Aqsa Mosque, they had betrayed Jerusalem, and they had betrayed the Palestinian issue by agreeing to establish relations with Israel. The Arabs are also reminding the Palestinians of the many opportunities they missed when they rejected a number of peace initiatives and plans over the last 25 years. A Lebanese journalist expressed outrage over the Palestinians' labeling of the signing ceremony between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain as a black day. This journalist pointed out that the Palestinians referred to their expulsion from Jordan back in the early 1970s as Black September. At that time, what happened was the Palestinians were in Jordan and they tried to murder Jordan's King Hussein. The king, after his defeat in the 1967 Six-Day War with Israel, had allowed the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, to establish military bases in his kingdom, Jordan, presumably as a basis to attack Israel. When the Palestinians, however, tried to overthrow the Jordanian government, he expelled them to Lebanon. I remember this. I remember that time the Palestinians were running away from the Jordanians, and they were swimming across the Jordan River to Israel to get away from the army of King Hussein. But after they went to Lebanon, they participated in the Lebanese Civil War that began in 1975 and continued launching terror attacks against Israel. In 1982, after Israel led an invasion into Lebanon, the Palestinians were again expelled, this time to Tunisia. 50 years after Black September, or call it whatever you like, nothing has changed. This Jordanian journalist wrote the following: the Palestinian leaders are refusing to learn from past experiences. The Palestinian armed organizations have repeated Jordan's experience in Lebanon. They played a role in destroying Lebanon during the Civil War. Would the Palestinian issue have benefited had the Palestinian organizations managed in 1970 to overthrow King Hussein? So what we see is that after the Saddam Hussein of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, which had peacefully been hosting nearly 500,000 Palestinian workers, they supported the Hussein's attack on Kuwait. After Kuwait was liberated by an American-led coalition, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were deported from Kuwait and other Gulf states. And by the way, when I lived in Karnei Shomron, I used to stop at a gas station that was operated by two Palestinians. And one of them told me that he had been living very well in Kuwait and sending money back to his family in Palestine, in what they call Palestine. And they were thrown out because the Palestinian terrorist organization supported the invasion of Kuwait. So one would have thought that Abu Mazen, the Mahmoud Abbas, who's now the head of the Palestinian Authority, would have learned from the mistakes of Yasser Arafat, from the mistakes of the experience of Jordan and Lebanon. But he learned the worst from Yasser Arafat. Half a century after what Palestinians call Black September, nothing has changed. The Palestinians still have the ability to make the same mistake. So all kind of political analysts in the Arab world, like in Saudi Arabia, point out that the Palestinian leadership has rejected. The Palestinians have rejected a number of peace initiatives and treaties. Each time, the Palestinians lost out because they didn't take advantage. Unfortunately, Palestinian leaders repeat the same mistakes. They rejected the Egyptian and Jordanian peace initiatives. They rejected U.S. President Bill Clinton's peace initiative in the Camp David summit in the year 2000. Now they're rejecting President Donald Trump's peace initiative, and finally they reject the peace initiatives of the UAE and Bahrain. So the bottom line, and the Arab writers are now writing about this in Iraq and in Saudi Arabia, that the Palestinians' problem is that their leaders do not want a Palestinian state. They have failed to establish their state because they did not want to establish a state. One of the writers, an Iraqi editorial writer, said, I mean the political leaders, some of whom still insist on repeating revolutionary slogans. The establishment of a Palestinian state will be a burden on the Palestinian leadership, prevent them from practicing corruption. The Palestinians need to realize that others were tired of them. The Palestinian Authority is no longer suitable to represent the Palestinian people. And this is what Arab writers and Arab journalists are saying about the Palestinians. So the bottom line is that they are losing their few friends they had in the world, and they're being rejected by other Arab and Muslim countries. And that's the bottom line. And all this is punctuated by the agreement between Israel and two Muslim states, which in a sense show that the Palestinians are simply on the wrong track, and it will lead them nowhere. I'll be back after the break.
Hi everyone, this is Andrea Simento from Jerusalem, inviting you to drop everything and join me on my show, Pull Up a Chair. We'll visit this week's quirky stories, meet fabulous guests, and discover my Israel. Together we'll laugh, shout, and explain the topics that make us say, hey, we've got to talk about that. So get comfortable and pull up a chair with me, Andrea Simento, every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Did you know this psalm and many others were composed by a Jewish shepherd and musician who later became a king? Would you like to know some of the inner meanings of psalms to help you connect with God and strengthen your soul? An exciting and easy-to-read book is now available which will help you do just that. Software for the Soul, Psalms for Everyone, available on Kindle, Audible, and Amazon.com. Software for the Soul.
Modesty at the beach? It isn't just about body image. It's about feeling good. Modest swimsuits, so we don't get burned by the sun.
So we won't get ogled by strangers.
So we'll feel free to express ourselves without the need to expose ourselves.
Let Marcy Modest help you to cover up what you want, how you want.
Made in Israel.
Visit marcymodest.com. That's MARSEA modest.com.
And get a 10% discount on your first purchase.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
We're back with Jay Shapiro. Apropos of the Palestinians being more or less being pushed out by their Arab brothers, I saw an article by an Emirati, a woman who lives in the Emirates. Her name is Sarah Al-Nuaimi, and I want to quote what she said. Keep in mind, by the way, that there are a lot of foreign workers in the Arab Emirates who have absolutely no rights, voting, or anything else, but that's beside the point. So she wrote the following. The United Arab Emirates and Bahrain have taken a serious step in moving out of the draconian shackles of mindless and mumbling caliphate fantasies that some extremists mention as wiping out the Jewish people in a final conquest of the globe. The United Arab Emirates groundwork to weed out this hogwash began 5 years ago. In 2015, the United Arab Emirates passed a law against religious discrimination by creating ministries of tolerance, happiness, and youth to develop an enlightened community, everyone included. A year later, schools in the United Arab Emirates started teaching students peace and tolerance. By 2019, we were open and receptive to a memorable year in our national history. It was named the Year of Tolerance. It was then that the construction of the Abrahamic family house was announced. It will include in one place a synagogue, a church, and a mosque. That same year, Pope Francis made an epic visit to the United Arab Emirates, where in the capital sports stadium, the first papal mass in Abu Dhabi was held, attended by close to 180,000 people. When the UAE prioritized national belonging over extremist obsessions, the decision immediately led to making peace with Israel. Who would have known that a small country, the UAE, with 1.4 million citizens, who are the size of a fingernail compared to the fist of the Middle East, would usher in such a force of clarity and positive alignment? The divide created is a gaping gorge, much needed. Palestinian sentiments are important but not sacred. It would just be sad if the Palestinians chose to get left behind. In the larger scheme of things, what onlookers from the outside fail to notice about the Middle East is the religiosity of the Arab world. Religiosity is a vital lens for assessing Middle Eastern affairs. The Arab-Israeli conflict is essentially a religious one. Arabs were frantic with delusions when Israel decided officially to join the neighborhood, even though Jews have continuously lived in this area for more than 3,000 years. Judea, after all, is named for the Jews. It was first the Babylonians, then the ancient Romans who tried to change those facts on the ground. Arabs rejected a UN partition plan in 1947 and began propagating conspiracy theories that demonized Israelis. The continued Jewish migration out of the gas chamber horrors to be reunited with the Western Wall was met with Arabs denying the Holocaust altogether. Their anti-Semitism was deeply entrenched in a long-taught hatred. Jews were accepted as inferior neighbors, not empowered neighbors. My hope as an Emirati is that we become a light for the world. It could make the entire region, the lives of everyone, including the Palestinians, so unimaginably greater. That, unquote, that this woman lives in the Emirates. She lives in Abu Dhabi, and she wrote this article. What she fails to mention, it's a very positive article. She fails to mention that the million or so people who live in the Emirates are the only ones that have any rights there. There's a tremendous number of foreign workers who have no rights whatsoever. So that's the end of that topic of the Palestinians and the new Israeli peace treaty. But I want to go into a different subject now because we are in an election year in the United States. As a matter of fact, the election is less than just about 40 days away. So I just read something recently about the American Jews and the election. I want to share it with the listeners. According to a survey, only 4% of Jews in the United States define Israel as their first or second most important election concern. Of higher priority to American Jews are domestic issues such as racial equality, LGBT rights, health care, gun control, Social Security, and Medicare. Nevertheless, according to a Pew Research Center study, the overwhelming majority of American Jews are not just pro-Israel, but proud of their connection to the Jewish state. But they do not express their proud connection at the ballot box. And just as Jewish identity based on sentiment carries consequences for the Jewish future, so too are there ramifications for harboring special feelings toward Israel while being unmindful of the reality of Israel, understanding what it really means. This is currently manifest in the November American presidential election. The overwhelming choice of American Jews for president is the Democratic candidate and former U.S. Vice President Joe Biden. Now, he has made it clear that he has a commitment to rejoining the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iranian nuclear deal, and rescinding the punishing economic sanctions placed on Iran by the Trump administration. In other words, the United States entered into a deal, the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known as the Iran nuclear deal, that allowed the Iranians to push forward to getting a nuclear weapon. And Trump stepped out of that agreement, but Joe Biden says he will go back to it. The agreement's supporters argue that its terms in combination with international monitoring, will ultimately keep Iran from getting toward a nuclear weapon. But critics see it really as a way of delaying Iran's nuclear ambitions. So it's all technical. The loudest critic of the joint agreement is Israel. Iran's leaders have threatened to wipe Israel off the map, and they employ language reminiscent of Hitler and Goebbels. The day after the agreement was signed, polls taken indicated between 70 and 78% of Israelis opposed the American agreement with Iran. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu twice brought Israel's case to the plenum of the UN, and in an unprecedented action, he did it before a specially called joint session of the U.S. Congress. By the way, this was not at the invitation of the President, Obama, but rather the opposition Republican Speaker of the House. That's a big difference. Now, Obama saw this as disrespect for his office, and that's unfortunate. In a public dispute between a U.S. president and Israel's prime minister, American Jews could not and would not challenge a man, Obama, upon whom they look with almost messianic fervor. That's how the American Jews looked upon Obama. Now, this is very different than what happened back in 1981 when Reagan was president and he was providing AWACS aircraft to Saudi Arabia. And at that time, Jewish organizations really came out against the American president. Now, Jews have been blinded, and first of all, they see local problems as being primary, which of course is important. But for example, they voted for Roosevelt by like 82%, 85%, 90%, 90% in the 4 times that Roosevelt ran. The Jews overwhelmingly voted for him. Now we found out historically that he wasn't that good to the Jews. There was a book called The Jews Should Keep Quiet, and written by a guy named Raphael Medoff, and it showed that Roosevelt, his esteem for the Jews was not as much as they liked him. So, although an unprecedented number of Jews were hired by the Roosevelt administration, his attitude toward the Jews as a group was disparaging. But the Jews kept voting for him. They never contemplated putting direct pressure on the White House for what was happening to the Jews in Europe under Hitler. So today we have the exact same thing. The Jews overwhelmingly are going to vote for Joe Biden, despite the fact that he says he would reinstate the agreement that would allow the Iranians to rush forward to getting a nuclear weapon, which they warned they will use against Israel. But there's no doubt that the majority of American Jews carry special feeling toward Israel, but these cannot compete with their liberalism expressed through a fierce loyalty to the Democratic Party. So the question is, when will the American Jews wise up, if at all, about the Democratic candidate and his attitude for what's going to happen in the Middle East? I just wanted to share that with the listeners, something to think about in the next 40 days before the election. I don't get involved in politics on this program. I just simply like to cite what is historically true. I'll be back again after the break.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
and me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. In this last segment of the program, I want to talk about several different items which I think the listeners will find of interest. First of all, I want to say something about the Jewish community and Bahrain. Israel just signed an agreement with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. So let's see what we know about the Jews of Bahrain. The signing of the agreements are called the Abraham Accords. They're expected to open up routes for collaboration, trade, and travel between Bahrain and Israel, which had all been restricted till now. It should have a significant impact on Bahrain's Jews, many of whom have relatives in Israel they have not been able to visit. What about the Jewish community in Bahrain? Bahrain is an island nation of about 1.5 million people. The Jewish community dates back about 140 years to the late 1800s, when a group of Iraqi Jews arrived in search of economic opportunities. Many were very poor and they lacked education, but they found jobs and eventually success, particularly in the clothing industry. They were kind of misfits coming out of Iraq. In other words, they weren't getting anywhere in Iraq, so they decided to try their luck in Bahrain. A smaller number of Jews also settled in Bahrain from Iran at around the same time. At its height, in the 1920s and 1930s, the Jewish community had about 800 members, though others have said the number was as high as 1,500. Though community members mixed socially with the Bahraini Muslims, they mainly married within the community and they lived close to each other. Members of the Jewish community continue to speak a Jewish dialect of Iraqi Arabic and still do. It's their form of Yiddish. In 1935, a member of the Cartier family, the Jewish clan who founded the jewelry company, passed through Bahrain on a business trip, and they ended up donating money to build a synagogue and bring in a rabbi. Over the next 10 years, the community continued to flourish economically and gathered in the synagogue for services. And this was apparently a fantastic and unusual time for all of them. But things took a turn for the worse following the 1947 UN partition vote, which recommended the creation of a Jewish state and an Arab one in Palestine. The move led to anti-Semitic riots throughout the Arab world, including in Bahrain. A group of rioters burned the synagogue to the ground and stole the country's only Torah scroll. Most of the community left after the attack, or in the decade and a half following the attack. The few who remain, or their descendants, make up the 50 or so Jews living in the country today. 50. There is an active Jewish cemetery, but that's an odd word. I saw a note that says an active Jewish cemetery. It's talking about a cemetery being active sounds strange, but essentially I think what it means is that of those 50 Jews, if any pass away, they're buried there. The synagogue we built in the 1980s never officially reopened, and most of the community continues to pray at home. They're thinking now of renovating the building and hope to reopen it next year as a house of worship and a museum. Jared Kushner, Trump's Jewish son-in-law, who serves as his senior advisor, gave the Bahrain's King Hamad bin Isa al Khalifa a Torah scroll for the synagogue. Most of the CUNY members today are financially successful, very successful, and they continue to be represented in the Shura Council. The Shura Council is the upper chamber of the National Assembly of Bahrain. There is a seat, a designated seat, in the Shura Council for representatives of the country's Jewish and Christian population. A woman named Huda Nonu went on to serve as Bahraini ambassador to the United States. She was succeeded by Nancy Khadouri, a relative of the powerful Khadouri family, which is a Hong Kong-based Jewish family of Iraqi origin, who went on to become one of the wealthiest families in Asia. Still, the local Jewish community is aging as many young people leave to study abroad and they choose to remain in other countries after their studies. Now, it is hoped that the new agreement with Israel will turn around the trend and that plans to build the so-called Abrahamic family house, a site that will host a church, a mosque, and a synagogue in the nearby United Emirates, and they're hoping that may draw more Jews to settle in the Gulf. So that's pretty much the picture of the Jews of Bahrain. I wanted to share this with the listeners to get an eye of what's happening. Now I want to switch gears to another subject, the mental and physical costs of the lockdown that we're in now. There is a lot of physical and mental health problems that are just as devastating as the virus itself. There's an organization called the Israeli Society for Community Mental Health, which is part of the Israeli Medical Association. So what they've found is that they have a group of more than 100 mental health clinicians, including directors of mental health clinics from health funds and health ministry clinic directors and so forth, and even private providers. So they've come up with a lot of statistics. In the last few weeks, for example, there's been a 20 to 30% increase in referrals to these organizations. These include patients who are children, adolescents, adults, and elderly. The mental health system was already stretched to the limit before this crisis and can't keep up with the present pressure. People talk about their loneliness. The elderly say there's no joy in life when they can't see their families and take part in the activities that they love. Unlike in a war or an economic crisis, people can't turn to their families for comfort because they're afraid of infecting them or being infected. On the other hand, in situations where families are forced to spend time together without the opportunity to go out and see other people, like this lockdown, it can cause a great deal of stress. The ministry just released numbers that showed an increase in the number of people who committed suicide between January and September of this year in comparison to 2 years prior. This year, about 200 people committed suicide. The problem of rising suicide rate during lockdown is not unique to Israel. In May, it was reported in the news in America that said that doctors at a medical center in California said there were more deaths by suicide than deaths from the COVID-19 itself. They report that they've never seen numbers like this in such a short period of time. The Hebrew University of Jerusalem professor Hooper said isolation and quarantine are not positive for people's mental health. There have been increasing levels of depression and anxiety in people who were not experiencing depression and anxiety before. These are sort of contradictory data on whether people who were anxious and depressed prior to the first closure are feeling worse now. They don't really know. The stress of being stuck at home, coupled with the financial uncertainty from the virus related to things like layoff, has resulted in a spike in domestic violence also. In June, the Knesset's Labor, Welfare, and Health Committee met to discuss a 40% rise in the number of reports of domestic violence since the start of the pandemic. In terms of physical health, many Israelis have reported gaining weight and exercising less during the last lockdown. According to a study conducted by Hebrew University, 55% of Israelis gained weight during the first coronavirus lockdown, as their training regimens were severely affected by the in-place orders. In other words, there's mental and physical costs of lockdown, and by the way, all the medical procedures and tests that are considered non-essential were canceled. A health professional said the following: "It's important for everyone to take care of themselves as best as they can. How the government messages is important. If people feel they're staying inside not just to protect themselves, but also to protect other people, if they feel there's an impact on society due to their actions, it will help them stay positive. The goal is not to rid ourselves of all stress, but to manage stress and regulate it to a manageable level, not to let it consume us." That is my positive message to end this program. Take care of yourselves until next time.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom! Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.